Today, we're plunging into a subject that's genuinely captivating and often challenges our modern assumptions: sex and relationships in ancient Egypt. We've gathered an incredible array of sources: academic papers, bits from scholarly works, archaeological finds, and even some pretty surprising ancient medical papyri. Our mission for you today is to really explore the intimate lives of the ancient Egyptians. We want to uncover what was considered normal, what was taboo, and how love and relationships were woven into, the very fabric of their daily existence, their art, and even their deepest religious beliefs. Get ready for some genuine aha moments, because honestly, what we've uncovered might just surprise you.
Yeah, what's truly striking here is how often our modern preconceptions about these ancient societies just clash with the actual historical evidence. We're going to try and pull back the curtain on a culture that approached sexuality with an openness and, frankly, a profound pragmatism that you might not expect at all.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The sources really paint this picture of sexuality in ancient Egypt as, well, just another aspect of life on Earth. It sounds incredibly natural, integrated almost, normal in its acceptance. So what was their overall attitude towards something so fundamental?
Well, the prevailing attitude was undeniably open and pragmatic. Consensual sex, for the most part, wasn't subject to the kind of, heavy moralistic taboos we often associate with ancient cultures. One Egyptologist actually points to a relaxed attitude to sex, even noting that premarital intercourse incurred no particular stigma.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a key insight, really. Their concern wasn't so much with premarital purity as it was with things like lineage and social order.
Right. No shame around premarital sex. That's quite a departure from many other historical societies. Did they even have a concept of virginity as we might understand it?
That's fascinating, isn't it? Our sources indicate Egyptians had no word for virgin. And this isn't just a linguistic quirk. It suggests that a woman's prior sexual experience simply wasn't seen as a social defect. Think about that. It implies their societal values were just oriented elsewhere. And furthermore, we find these medical papyri prescribing contraceptives for women, which speaks volumes really about a practical rather than purely moralistic view on managing reproduction. It truly was seen as a normal, manageable part of life and procreation, not something inherently, sinful.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting, I think. The sources mention that erotic pleasure itself could even have sacred overtones, like the pharaoh symbolically ejaculating into the Nile to renew fertility, echoing the myth of the creator god Adam.
Exactly. Who brought the world into being through, autoerotic means?
So sex wasn't just tolerated, it actually had profound divine and cosmic significance for them.
It did. It tied directly into the cosmic order, connecting human fertility to the fertility of the land and the divine act of creation itself. It wasn't just a physical act, it was kind of a reflection of the universe's fundamental generative power.
Okay, so if premarital sex was generally accepted and even divine acts of self-pleasure held sacred meaning, where did they draw the line? What behaviors were regulated or stigmatized in what seems like such an open society?
That's a crucial question, yeah. Because while many consensual acts were fine, certain behaviors that threatened social order or disrupted family lineage or violated ritual purity, those were strongly prescribed. The most universally condemned was adultery, particularly for married women.
Yeah, okay.
Literary tales, like the very popular Tale of Two Brothers, repeatedly warn against infidelity. They showcase the profound ruin it could bring upon a family, a reputation. A married woman caught in adultery could face severe punishments, even death by burning, if her husband really insisted. This highlights that while individual sexual expression seems broad, fidelity within marriage, especially for women, was absolutely a cornerstone of their social contract. It was really about preserving legitimate heirs and the stability of the household.
Which was the bedrock of their society, right? And what about incest? That carries such a strong taboo in most cultures we know. Was that also a boundary for them?
For the general populace, yes, definitely.
Mm.
Incestuous unions were generally not openly practiced or encouraged. However, and here's a fascinating nuance, a real exception. Royal dynasties sometimes flouted these restrictions.
Right, the royals.
Pharaohs commonly married sisters, or even daughters. This wasn't about personal preference, it seems, but about maintaining the royal bloodline as pure as possible. They saw themselves as representatives of the divine on earth, you see. So this was a privilege, maybe even a divine imperative for them, but forbidden to ordinary families.
That really highlights the role of power dynamics in shaping norms, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That distinction between royal and commoner behavior is very telling.
Our sources also mention that sexual taboos often centered on the abuse of power. What does that reveal about their core values?
Well, this is where their pragmatic approach really shines through, I think. Recent scholarship suggests that the main sexual taboos in Egypt primarily focused on things like officials coercing subordinates, forcible sex, even raping a slave was punishable. We actually have records mentioning flogging for a rapist or a husband having his nose cut off if his wife committed adultery.
Wow.
So it reflects a public attitude that sexual violence and the exploitation of power were criminal offenses. They violated the principle of Ma, that cosmic order and justice they held so dear.
So it wasn't necessarily about the sex itself.
Exactly. It was about the violation of consent and social harmony.
And how did this nuanced perspective extend to same-sex relationships? This is often such a complex and debated topic in ancient history.
It is particularly nuanced, yeah. And perhaps one of the most surprising insights for many. There was no ancient Egyptian law that explicitly banned same-sex activity. No. The taboo wasn't about loving a same-sex partner per se, but rather the receptive or passive role in male-male intercourse, especially for a free man. Egyptian ideology linked sexual dominance with manhood, with strength, and citizenship.
Okay, so it's about roles.
Very much so. We see this in the myth of Seth attempting to violate Horus. This act sparked outrage, not because it was a homosexual encounter, but because it aimed to make Horus appear womanly, penetrated, thereby demeaning his status and power. The emphasis was squarely on maintaining prescribed gender roles and the integrity of one's status.
But then there's that incredible evidence of male intimacy, like the tomb of Niankhnum and Numhotep. That seems to challenge the idea of a complete prohibition on same-sex affection. How do we reconcile that?
That's where the nuance becomes absolutely critical. At the mastaba of Niankhnum and Hunumhotep, these were royal manicurists. The two men are portrayed embracing, holding hands, in poses usually reserved for husband and wife, including that intimate act of smelling a lotus flower, which was typically a wifely gesture.
Right, I remember that detail.
The tomb's whole design suggests they saw each other as permanent life partners. This indicates that personal, committed same-sex affection could indeed be expressed, maybe even celebrated privately, provided it didn't fundamentally invert those dominant masculine norms. The sources generally seem to criticize the act of anal intercourse rather than male-to-male intimacy and affection. So the intimacy itself wasn't necessarily the issue.
But the perceived role reversal in the act itself.
Precisely.
And what about those stories involving higher status individuals, like Pharaoh Neferkare you mentioned earlier?
Yes, there's that Middle Kingdom story of Pharaoh Neferkare who clandestinely sleeps with a general. This tale, which seems to be a satirical parody, implies such behavior was considered scandalous, but not so taboo as to be unmentionable.
Ah, okay. So scandalous, but not unthinkable.
Right. The scandal wasn't the act itself, necessarily, but the secrecy and how it contradicted royal duty and public appearance. Again, the emphasis seems to be on status and social order, not strictly on the gender of the partners involved.
And what about female same-sex relationships? Are they documented at all?
That's a good question. They are virtually undocumented in the surviving records we have. This suggests either they were rare, or perhaps more likely, they simply weren't discussed in the formal public texts that tend to survive. There's no clear evidence of Egyptian laws punishing lesbianism, and it might well have been tolerated similarly quietly, just existing outside the framework of official concern about lineage and public display.
So it really sounds like our modern labels like gay or bi just don't quite fit their understanding of sexuality at all?
That's absolutely crucial to grasp. Sexuality for Egyptians seems to have been understood more in terms of acts and status, like free citizen versus slave, active versus passive, not fixed identity categories like we think of today. This made their customs confusing to some later observers, like the Greeks and Romans. But for Egyptians, it seems these quiet liaisons simply existed outside official concern, as long as they didn't disrupt the established order or challenge masculine status.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly now to marriage and family. Given their pragmatic approach to sexuality, how did Egyptians typically approach forming families? Was it a big public ceremony or something more low-key?
It was remarkably personal and domestic. Marriage in ancient Egypt was a contract, yes, but not a heavily ritualized state affair like we might imagine. Archaeologists find no evidence for elaborate public ceremonies. A couple simply became husband and wife when the woman entered the man's home, usually with an agreed-upon bride price.
That's it.
That's pretty much it. It was so informal, it was basically synonymous with setting up a house.
Wow.
This pragmatic approach, again, reflects their focus on practical outcomes, establishing a household, producing heirs, maintaining the social fabric.
So essentially a private arrangement for setting up a home. And was
Mhm.
monogamy the norm for most people?
For commoners, yes, monogamy was certainly the norm, often for very practical economic reasons, frankly. Running a household was expensive. However, kings frequently took multiple wives and concubines, primarily to ensure succession and, strengthen political alliances. Even in those cases, though, if a king or a noble had multiple partners, the first wife typically remained the mistress of the house, holding a special status and authority over the household.
Now, one of the most striking things in the sources, and definitely an aha moment for me, is the significant rights women seem to have within marriage. This feels quite advanced for the ancient world. Why do you think that was?
Oh, it's truly fascinating, isn't it? The extent of rights Egyptian women were accorded. And this wasn't just a nicety, it was embedded in their legal and social structure. There's that famous advice from the royal vizier Tahotep to his son. Love your wife with passion, feed her, clothe her, ointment is the remedy for her body, and please her heart all the days of her life with you.
That's quite a strong directive.
It is. It's not just about affection, it's an expectation of treating wives well, ensuring their comfort and happiness. Partly, perhaps, because a content wife contributed to a stable household, which was vital for society. And legally, a wife's property remained her own, even after marriage. She retained full dowry and inheritance rights. Crucially, wives could initiate divorce.
They could initiate it.
Yes, and a marriage contract often specified the husband's obligation to support his wife and children after a separation. In a divorce, the wife generally left with about one-third of the joint property. So this wasn't just the husband's domain. Wives were active, legally recognized partners with significant agency. It reflects a societal value placed on family stability and maybe individual economic security.
And children were clearly central to family life, especially for perpetuating the family line. Was that tied into matat as well?
Absolutely. The perpetuation of the family line, having legitimate heirs, was paramount. Fidelity was highly valued precisely for this reason, especially female fidelity. The instruction of Annie advises marrying around age 20 so that you can get children in your youth, highlighting that social expectation of procreation. Mothers were highly venerated, almost sacred figures in a way, and tomb scenes frequently depict these loving family moments, symbolizing domestic bliss and the ideal of a stable, fertile household, which was seen as a microcosm of the harmonious cosmic order of Manat.
Diving a bit deeper into gender roles then, the sources describe them as comparatively fluid in daily life, but sexual roles carried expectations. How did that actually work in practice? It sounds like an interesting paradox.
It is an interesting tension. While Egyptian society was certainly patriarchal in its overall structure, women enjoyed a degree of autonomy that was unusual in many other ancient societies. Men were generally the active partners in, say, sex, and managed external affairs like trade or public administration. But wives often co-governed family property, managed the household internally, and held significant economic power within the home.
So a real partnership in running things.
Yes, there was an ideal of companionate marriage. Wives often addressed husbands as brother or friend, reflecting this deep partnership. This flexibility in daily life, combined with those stronger expectations in sexual roles, allowed for a functioning society that valued both individual contribution and clear social structures.
So their legal and social standing for women truly was more progressive than many of their contemporaries.
It really was, yes.
Yeah.
Beyond property rights and the ability to initiate divorce, fathers could even stipulate in marriage contracts that their daughter's husband must not take another wife.
They could put that in the contract.
Yes, and if he did, the contract allowed the first wife to divorce with full compensation. This isn't just about legal standing. It speaks to a strong cultural belief in the mutual partnership of marriage and the wife's security within it. It's a level of legal protection for women you just rarely see in the ancient world.
And in this context, how was female sexuality viewed? Was it suppressed or was it celebrated?
Oh, it's very much celebrated rather than hidden or shamed. Egyptian love poetry, wisdom texts, they often celebrate women's beauty and sexual allure quite openly. One scholar emphasizes that an Egyptian woman, quote, did not have to hide her body during any period of Egyptian history, but its charms were even accentuated in wall paintings and reliefs.
Interesting.
And the fertility goddess Hathor really embodies this ideal of feminine erotic power and joy. It underscores that female sensuality was seen as a positive, even a divine force.
So how did this open yet regulated view of sexuality show up in their art and literature? Was it explicit or was it more symbolic?
It was largely symbolic and pretty restrained in public contexts. Monumental temple art rarely shows overt sexual acts. Religious architecture just wasn't the space for erotic display. However, hints of sensuality definitely appear in tomb scenes, wall reliefs, and especially in their literary texts. Lovers are often shown holding hands, dancing, serenading each other, conveying intimacy through suggestive gestures rather than explicit depiction.
Right.
New Kingdom papyri contain these beautiful love songs with richly erotic metaphors comparing eyes to gazelles or bodies to columns, that sort of thing. But for more explicit content, you typically have to look to private art or maybe even humor, which were less bound by public decorum.
You mentioned the Turin erotic papyrus earlier. What exactly was that all about, and what does it tell us about their private views?
Ah, yes, the Turin Papyrus. It dates from around 1150 BCE, and it's quite a unique find. It illustrates men and women, sometimes with animals, engaged in various sexual acts, often in a very crude, almost caricatured style. These images were likely meant as comic satires, or perhaps even a form of lesson literature, maybe warnings, definitely not pornography in our modern sense of just aiming for arousal. But they clearly show that sexual play and humor were imagined and depicted, at least in private art. Similarly, graffiti found on walls sometimes included crude drawings. It suggests a kind of certain prudishness in highly public official art, but a very vivid and uninhibited sexual imagination in unofficial media. It's that interesting contrast again between public decorum and private expression.
So it was there, but often encoded or allegorical in the more public spaces.
Precisely. Iconographically, sex and fertility symbols are everywhere once you know what to look for. Min, the god of male procreation, often shown with an exaggerated erect phallus. The lotus flower, frequently seen held to the nose, is a common erotic motif. It can even be used to convey subtle erotic nuance, like in Yanknum's tomb, where Nemhotep is shown smelling the lotus like a wife normally would.
Implying that subtle role reversal we talked about.
Exactly. Egyptian literature, too, treats sex somewhat obliquely in its more formal texts. Love poems speak of intimacy through metaphor and nature imagery. Wisdom texts offer marital advice that equates conjugal love with good governance. We find very little information on sexual positions and practices surviving in detail, which implies Egyptians didn't consider detailed descriptions worthy of formal record. It was just a natural part of life, not something to be anatomized or obsessed over in writing.
Okay, stepping back from the home, how did these public attitudes shape sexual morality in the broader society, and how did that principle of Ma'at play into this?
Right, Ma'at. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Ma'at represents cosmic order, social harmony, justice. Healthy sexuality, understood as loving, consensual, and procreative within the framework of a stable family, was considered part of upholding Ma'at. So, actions that destabilized marriage or exploited power, those violated this fundamental principle. Adultery, for instance, features prominently in their folklore, not just as a personal failing, but as a disruptive sin. Something that could cause problems in the wider community, undermining social trust. Even the gods' adventures often reinforced marital loyalty in the end, showing how central it was to their concept of a well-ordered existence.
But was there a double standard for men's infidelity versus women's? That's often a common thread in patriarchal societies.
Unfortunately, yes, a double standard was certainly present. Men's unfaithfulness was less often publicly castigated, reflecting the asymmetry of their patrilineal society where lineage was traced through the male line. While monogamy was emphasized as a value even among the stories of the gods, human kings, as we said, were allowed multiple wives for dynastic purposes. Women, in contrast, bore the brunt of the moral enforcement, largely because their fidelity was seen as absolutely essential for ensuring legitimate heirs and maintaining that crucial social order.
But consensual sex, even outside marriage, seems to have been tolerated, provided it didn't disrupt this order.
That's precisely right, provided it didn't threaten inheritance rights, violate consent, or overtly destabilize the social order. Consensual sex among adults seemed to have incurred no legal sanction. There's even a candid Proverbs collection that includes a recipe for plying a reluctant lover with a love charm, treating love magic as a legitimate pursuit.
Really?
A recipe, yes. It reveals this remarkably pragmatic, almost non-judgmental approach to personal attraction and its pursuit, as long as it didn't violate the core principles of Ma'at.
So sexuality wasn't just a social matter for them. It was deeply, deeply intertwined with religion and mythology. How did the Egyptians connect sex to their gods and their whole understanding of the cosmos?
Oh, it was truly inseparable from their religious beliefs. Many deities embodied aspects of sexual power and fertility. We mentioned the creator god Adam.
Right, generating the first deities through autoerotic means.
Exactly. And pharaohs ritually emulated this act to guarantee the Nile inundation, the flooding, and the rebirth of the sun god. It underscores that sexual potency was seen as a divine gift, fundamental to creation and regeneration.
So their very creation myths were literally about sexual generation. That's incredibly direct.
It is. And other gods like Hathor, the chief goddess of love, beauty, female sexuality, she was celebrated in sensual festivals. Women called upon Hathor for aid in conception and childbirth, just as men might invoke Min for male potency. Amulets shaped like an erect phallus or a lotus flower were common fertility talismans worn daily. It signifies the pervasive presence of this divine connection in their everyday lives.
And what about the famous Osiris-Isis myth? That involves a miraculous conception, which sounds very significant.
The Osiris-Isis legend is absolutely a paradigmatic example of this sacred sexuality. Isis, after painstakingly resurrecting her murdered brother husband Osiris.
Which is an incredible story in itself.
Right. She lies with him and conceives Horus that very night. This posthumous conception symbolizes the continuity of kingship beyond death. It highlights the sacred, life-giving potency of intercourse, even overcoming death itself. Even Seth's attempted rape of Horus, as we discussed, is framed not just as a sexual crime, but as an assault on cosmic order, an act bringing chaos, reinforcing that link between appropriate sexual behavior and Majat.
It even sounds like sexuality had a role in the afterlife for them. What did they believe about that?
That's another fascinating aspect. They believe the body must be complete and potent in the afterlife to support the soul, the Ka and Ba. So tomb texts include these magical formulas meant to restore the deceased sexual members. Why? So they might copulate with the dead, perhaps meaning unite with Osiris or continue their lineage, symbolically ensuring continued life forces and regeneration in the next world. One Greek historian even notes that embalmers might delay burial until, as he put it, the spirit of intercourse has taken place, perhaps a ritual act, to prevent restless phantoms. It speaks to a belief that sexual vitality was essential for a peaceful and potent eternal existence.
What a deep dive. We've certainly uncovered a society that viewed sex and relationships as absolutely integral to life, to law, and even to the divine. The ideal of a stable married couple with children was clearly at the heart of their society, but, and it's a big but, within those structures, women enjoyed remarkable legal and social powers.
Indeed, and we've seen that public art often conveyed sensuality quite discreetly, while private humor could be, well, pretty explicit. Taboos were few and remarkably specific, focused on things like adultery by wives, incest for commoners, coercive acts, or that inversion of prescribed male-female gender roles. Beyond those specific constraints, sexual diversity seems to have quietly existed, unburdened by explicit legal condemnation, as long as it didn't upset the social order.
And perhaps most striking, for me anyway, is how deeply intertwined sexuality was with their religious beliefs. From creation myths involving divine acts of self-pleasure to rituals for fertility and even spells for love and procreation. It was all just part of the cosmic order.
Precisely. Their approach wasn't really puritanical, nor was it purely hedonistic. It was fundamentally pragmatic, valuing consent, duty, and harmony, Ma'at above all else. Egyptians acknowledged the pleasures of the body, expressing real enthusiasm for love and fertility, but generally within the bounds of family duty and that overarching cosmic order.
So what does this all mean for you, listening in, as we reflect on ancient Egypt's really fascinating approach to sex and relationships? It really makes us consider, in a world where our own norms and taboos are constantly shifting, what enduring lessons, if any, can we draw from the Egyptians about consent, about agency, about the balance between personal intimacy and societal values, and maybe even about the sacred dimension of human connection? We've only scratched the surface today, of course, but hopefully you're now feeling well-informed and perhaps just a little more curious about the surprising intricacies of ancient human connection.